In the vast wilderness of Alaska, where civilization clings to existence like frost on glass, there are places that time forgot. Small towns scattered across a frozen landscape so remote that when something goes wrong, when something impossible happens, there's nowhere to run, no one to call. These aren't the ghost stories your grandfather told around a campfire. These aren't legends passed down through generations of fishermen and trappers. These are testimonies, real accounts from real people who experienced something that shouldn't exist, but does. Tonight, we're traveling to 12 of Alaska's most isolated communities. Places where the aurora borealis isn't the only thing that dances in the darkness. Where the silence between snowflakes carries whispers of the unknown. Where dispatchers receive calls from the dead. Where entire towns vanish without explanation. And where the ice itself seems to preserve nightmares that refuse to die. What you're about to hear comes from police reports, personal testimonies, and recordings that were never meant to see the light of day. Each story is a thread in a tapestry of terror that blankets Alaska's forgotten corners. Some will make you question what you know about life and death. Others will make you grateful you've never been truly alone in the wilderness. So settle in, turn down the lights, and remember, in Alaska's small towns, the cold isn't the only thing that can freeze your blood.
Please subscribe if you like my videos. Thank you.
Story 1. The Dead Man's Phone Call. Sarah McKinnon had been working the night shift at the Alaska State Trooper Dispatch Center for 11 years. She'd taken calls about everything: bear attacks, missing hikers, domestic disputes that turned deadly in the isolation of winter. But nothing had prepared her for the call that came through at 11:47 p.m. on January 15th, 2019. The phone rang once. Standard procedure dictated she answer on the second ring. Alaska State Troopers, this is dispatch. The voice on the other end was calm, eerily calm. Ma'am, I need to report a death. Sarah grabbed her pen, already pulling up the incident report screen. What's your location, sir? Mile marker 47 on the Parks Highway, about 2 miles north of Talkeetna. There's a blue Chevy pickup in the ditch on the east side of the road. Are you injured? Do you need medical assistance? No, ma'am. I'm dead. Sarah's pen stopped moving. In 11 years, she'd heard confused callers, drunk callers, people in shock who weren't making sense. But this man's voice was clear, matter of fact, like he was reporting the weather. Sir, I need you to clarify what you mean by that. I mean I died about 40 minutes ago. Truck hit a patch of ice, went off the road, broke my neck on impact. I can see my body from here. It's not moving. Sarah's training kicked in. Keep them talking. Get information. What's your name, sir? Marcus Chen, age 34. I was heading home from Anchorage after visiting my sister. Should have stayed the night, but I wanted to get back to my dogs. They don't like being alone too long. The casual way he mentioned his dogs sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She began typing, creating a dispatch for units to respond to mile marker 47. Marcus, I'm sending officers to your location right now. Can you describe what you're wearing? Blue jeans, red flannel shirt, brown Carhartt jacket. My wallet's in my back pocket. Driver's license should confirm everything. Marcus paused, and she could hear something in the background. Wind, maybe, or breathing that wasn't quite right. Ma'am, I need you to know something. This isn't the first time this has happened. Sarah's fingers froze over the keyboard. What do you mean? I mean, I've been making this call for 3 years now. Same accident, same location, same time. I die, I call you folks, officers come out and find my body. But somehow it keeps happening again. The temperature in the dispatch center seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah looked around at her coworkers, but they were busy with their own calls, unaware of the conversation that was unraveling her understanding of reality. Marcus, that's not possible. If you died 3 years ago. I know it's not possible, but here we are. His voice carried a sadness now, a weight that seemed to press through the phone line. Understand what? Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn into this impossible conversation, despite every rational thought screaming that this couldn't be real. That some things don't end when they should. Some moments get stuck, like a record with a scratch that keeps playing the same part over and over. I think that's what happened to me. The moment I realized I was dying, the moment I wanted more than anything to call for help, to hear another human voice one last time, that moment won't let me go. Unit 47 had just radioed in that they were en route to the location. Sarah knew that in 20 minutes they would find Marcus Chen's body exactly as he described. She also knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that this wouldn't be the last time she received this call. Marcus, is there anything you want me to tell your family? Anyone you want me to contact? My sister knows. She gets a call from the coroner every time they find me. She stopped crying after the 2nd year. Now she just listens, says she understands, and hangs up. I think she's waiting for this to end as much as I am. The background sound grew louder now, and Sarah realized it wasn't wind. It was the sound of metal creaking, settling, the sound of a truck that had just crashed, cooling in the Alaska night. Ma'am, I can see the headlights now. Your officers are here. They're getting out of their car, walking toward my truck. The tall one with the flashlight, he's going to check my pulse first. He won't find one. Sarah watched her computer screen as Unit 47 updated their status to on scene. Her radio crackled to life. Dispatch, Unit 47. We've got a single vehicle accident at mile marker 47. One fatality, male, appears to be mid-30s. Vehicle matches the description from your call. She keyed her radio. Copy that, Unit 47. Victim identification. Stand by. A moment passed. Victim is Marcus Chen, age 34. Ma'am, there's something strange here. The accident looks fresh, but this phone line was disconnected over a year ago. Paul came down in a storm last winter, never got repaired. No way anyone could have made a call from this location. Sarah looked down at her phone. The call timer showed 43 minutes and 17 seconds. The line was still active. Marcus? She whispered into her headset. I'm here, ma'am. Well, I'm somewhere. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying on the line with me. It gets lonely out here. Marcus, how do I help you? How do we make this stop? I don't think you can. But knowing someone hears me, knowing I'm not completely alone in this moment, that helps more than you know. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then Marcus spoke one last time, his voice fading like an echo in a vast empty space. Same time tomorrow night, ma'am. I'll be calling again. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, then at the incident report on her screen. She saved it, knowing that somewhere in the state trooper database there were 11 identical reports spanning 3 years, all with her signature, all impossible. The next night she worked a different shift, but her replacement, Janet Morrison, took a call at 11:47 p.m. from a man named Marcus Chen reporting his own death at mile marker 47 on the Parks Highway. The calls never stopped. They came every night to different dispatchers, but always the same conversation. Always the same impossible reality of a man who died but couldn't stop dying, trapped in a moment that refused to end.
Story 2: The Ice Ghosts of Wrangell. Elena Vasquez had photographed ice formations in 14 countries, but nothing had drawn her to Alaska like the rumors of Wrangell's crystal caves. Local mining records from the 1940s described ice formations that seemed to move on their own, creating geometric patterns too perfect to be natural. The mining company had abandoned the site after workers reported seeing figures in the ice that weren't there when they looked directly. Elena arrived in Wrangell on February 3, 2020, with enough equipment to document whatever phenomena the caves contained. The town's population had dwindled to fewer than 200 people, most of whom worked seasonal jobs or survived on subsistence hunting. When she asked about the abandoned mining site, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes looked away. People suddenly remembered urgent tasks elsewhere. The only person willing to discuss the caves was Thomas Aitken, an 80-year-old former miner who'd worked the site in 1973. "My father was there when they shut it down the first time," he told her over coffee at the town's only diner. "Said the ice talked to them. Not words, you understand, but it communicated. Showed them things that hadn't happened yet, or maybe had happened a long time ago." Thomas drew a crude map on a napkin, marking the trail to the caves. "Equipment fails up there. Compasses spin. GPS gives wrong coordinates. But if you're determined to go, go during the day. Don't stay past sunset. And whatever you do, don't trust what your cameras show you unless you can see it with your own eyes first." Elena hiked to the caves the next morning, following a trail that switchbacked through dense spruce forest before opening onto a barren plateau. The entrance to the mining site was partially collapsed, but large enough for her to squeeze through with her camera gear. Inside, her breath formed crystals that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics would allow. The ice formations were unlike anything in her experience. Crystalline structures rose from the cave floor in perfect spirals, their surfaces so clear they seemed to bend light in impossible directions. Elena began photographing immediately, using different lenses and exposure settings to capture the formations from every angle. It was through her telephoto lens that she first saw them. Humanoid figures suspended within the ice itself, not frozen corpses, but living crystalline beings that moved with fluid grace through the frozen medium. They were translucent, visible only through certain camera angles and lighting conditions. With her naked eye, she saw only empty ice. Through her lens, she watched an entire civilization going about their daily existence. The figures appeared to be engaged in complex activities. Some tended to geometric gardens of ice crystals that grew and shifted in real time. Others worked with tools that seemed to be made of compressed light, carving new formations from the cave walls. Children, if that's what they were, played games that involved reshaping their own crystalline bodies into different configurations. Elena shot hundreds of photos, switching between cameras to capture the beings from different perspectives. Each lens revealed different aspects of their world. Wide-angle shots showed vast ice cities extending beyond the visible cave boundaries. Macro lenses captured intricate facial features that were both alien and hauntingly familiar. As the day progressed, Elena became aware that the beings had noticed her. They began positioning themselves within her camera's field of view, posing in ways that suggested they understood they were being photographed. Some held up crystal formations that might have been tools, or art, or messages. Others gestured toward deeper parts of the cave system, as if inviting her to follow. Elena lost track of time. The cave's ambient light never seemed to change, creating a timeless environment where minutes felt like hours and hours passed like seconds. She moved deeper into the cave system, following the crystalline beings as they led her through chambers filled with increasingly complex ice formations. In the deepest chamber, Elena discovered what appeared to be a crystalline archive. The walls were covered with ice formations that contained moving images, like three-dimensional photographs that played out scenes from different time periods. She saw native Alaskan tribes interacting with the ice beings centuries before Russian colonization. She watched 1940s miners flee the caves in terror as the beings emerged from the walls. She saw herself photographing the very scenes she was witnessing. The temporal archive showed her other photographers and researchers who had visited the caves over the decades. Most left quickly, disturbed by glimpses of phenomena they couldn't explain. But some stayed too long, becoming fascinated by the being's world. Elena watched in horror as she saw what happened to those who remained past sunset. The ice beings weren't malevolent, but they existed in a different relationship with time and physical reality. Those who stayed too long began to synchronize with their temporal frequency. Their movements became fluid and graceful. Their skin took on a translucent quality that seemed to shift between flesh and crystal depending on the angle of observation. Elena looked at her watch and realized with growing panic that she'd been in the caves for over 8 hours. The sun would set soon, and she could already feel changes in her perception. Colors seemed more vivid. The cave's geometry felt more logical than the outside world's chaotic randomness. The crystalline being's gestures began to make sense, as if she were learning their language through direct neural transmission. She forced herself to run toward the cave entrance, even as part of her mind insisted that staying would reveal truths about reality that surface dwellers could never comprehend. The ice beings didn't try to stop her, but they watched her retreat with expressions that might have been disappointment or understanding. Elena emerged from the caves as the sun touched the horizon. Her equipment worked normally again. Her compass pointed true north. But when she reviewed her photographs that evening in her hotel room, she discovered that each image showed slightly different scenes. The ice beings appeared in different positions, engaged in different activities. Some photos showed additional figures that she didn't remember seeing. Others revealed architectural details that hadn't been visible during her visit. Over the following weeks, Elena became obsessed with the photographs. She enhanced them, analyzed them, created detailed maps of the ice being civilization. She returned to the caves repeatedly, each time staying longer, each time seeing more. Her online photography portfolio began attracting attention from researchers and paranormal investigators, but also from people who claimed the images hurt to look at or caused strange dreams about living
in crystalline cities beneath the ice. The Alaska State Troopers found Elena on March 15th after her hotel reported she'd been missing for 5 days. They discovered her in the deepest chamber of the cave system, alive but changed. Her skin had a translucent quality that seemed to shift between flesh and crystal, depending on the angle of observation. Her eyes reflected light like faceted gems. She spoke in a language that sounded like wind through ice formations, though she seemed to understand English perfectly. Elena's final photographs, recovered from her camera, showed Elena welcoming her into their community. The images revealed her transformation in stages, documenting her transition from flesh to something between human and crystalline entity. In the last photo, Elena stood among the ice beings as an equal, her form perfectly adapted to their frozen environment. She was transported to Anchorage for medical evaluation, but the doctors couldn't explain her condition. Her body temperature was below what should have been survivable, yet she showed no signs of hypothermia or frostbite. X-rays revealed a skeletal structure that appeared to be partially crystallized, though she showed no signs of pain or discomfort. Elena eventually returned to Wrangell, but she no longer stayed in the hotel. Local residents reported seeing her walking toward the caves at sunset and returning at dawn, her form becoming increasingly translucent with each passing night. Her photographs continued appearing online, uploaded from accounts that showed no human activity. The images documented an expanding crystalline civilization beneath Wrangell, growing more complex and extensive with each upload. The final photograph, posted 6 months after Elena's disappearance, showed the ice-being city extending far beyond the original cave system, connecting to similar settlements throughout Alaska's underground ice networks. Elena's camera was found abandoned at the cave entrance, but the memory cards were empty.
The only remaining evidence of her documentation were the photographs already shared online, which continued to affect viewers in disturbing ways. Some reported dreaming of ice cities. Others claimed to see crystalline figures in reflective surfaces. A few attempted to locate the Wrangell Caves themselves, though none were ever found again.
Story 3. The Cannery That Never Sleeps. Jake Morrison needed the money. Fresh out of high school, with no prospects and mounting family debt, the job posting for North Wind Seafood Processing seemed like a blessing. The pay was exceptional for seasonal work, room and board included, with bonuses for workers who stayed the full 6 months contract. The only requirement was complete commitment. Once you signed on, you couldn't leave until the season ended. The cannery sat on a remote stretch of coastline, accessible only by company boat. Jape arrived in May 2021 with 47 other workers, a mix of college students, drifters, and people running from various problems back home. The facility was impressive, a modern complex of processing buildings, dormitories, and support structures that could house 200 workers comfortably. The work was exactly what Jake expected. Long shifts, processing salmon, halibut, and crab in refrigerated buildings that never warmed above 40 degrees. The pay was deposited directly into their accounts weekly, with detailed statements showing earnings that exceeded every promise made during recruitment. Management was professional and efficient. The food was good. The dormitories were clean and comfortable. It should have been perfect. The first sign something was wrong came during Jake's second week. He noticed that some of the longer-term workers moved differently. Their motions were too precise, too efficient. They could process fish faster than anyone Jake had ever seen. Their knife work so perfect it seemed mechanical. When he asked how long they'd been working at the cannery, they all gave the same answer: "This is my first season." But Jake found employee records dating back years with some of their names. Marcus Webb, who claimed to be new, had apparently worked at Northwind for 3 consecutive seasons. Sarah Kim's employment record showed that she'd been there for 5 years, though she looked exactly the same age as when her first employee photo was taken. Jake mentioned the discrepancy to his bunkmate, Tony Reyes, who'd arrived on the same boat. Tony brushed it off initially, but began paying closer attention to their co-workers. "You're right," he whispered one night after lights out. "There's something off about the veteran workers. They never seem tired. They don't complain about the cold. And have you noticed they never eat in the cafeteria?" The two began documenting oddities around the facility. Workers who never seemed to sleep yet appeared fully rested every morning. Efficiency ratings that improved week by week to impossible levels. Employment records that showed the same people working year after year without aging. Most disturbing was the realization that no one ever talked about life before the cannery or plans for after the season ended. Jake tried to call his family during his scheduled communication time, but discovered that outside phone service had been temporarily interrupted due to equipment failure. Email access was limited to company accounts that seemed to filter outgoing messages. Letters were collected for batch mailing, but never seemed to actually leave the facility. The breakthrough came when Tony discovered a restricted area in the lower level of the main processing building.
Using a maintenance key card he'd borrowed, they accessed a laboratory filled with equipment that had nothing to do with fish processing. Chemical analysis stations, centrifuges, and refrigeration units containing thousands of vials filled with different solutions. The lab's computer system was password protected, but Tony had studied computer programming before dropping out of college. It took him 3 nights of after-hours work to crack the system and access the research files. What they found made them wish they'd never been curious. Northwind Seafood Processing was a front for something called Project Preservation. The company was conducting human trials of a chemical compound designed to slow cellular aging and increase physical efficiency. The compound was administered through the facility's food and water supply in carefully measured doses. Workers were unwitting test subjects in an experiment designed to create a more efficient and durable workforce. The files contained detailed medical records for every employee, tracking their physical and mental changes over time. Long-term subjects showed remarkable improvements in strength, endurance, and cognitive processing speed. They required less sleep, less food, and showed no signs of age-related deterioration. But they also displayed concerning side effects: decreased emotional range, reduced creative thinking, and most troubling, an inability to form memories of life before exposure to the compound. Jake and Tony realized they'd been consuming the experimental substance for 3 weeks. Blood test results in their files showed the compound was already integrating with their cellular structure. Projected timelines suggested complete assimilation within 2 months, at which point they would become permanent assets of Northwind Processing, their previous identities effectively erased. They attempted to escape that night, but discovered the facility's security was more extensive than they'd realized. Automated systems tracked every movement within the compound. Doors that had been accessible during the day were locked after hours. The communication equipment was disabled, and the boat that had brought them was secured with electronic locks they couldn't bypass. More disturbing was the realization that some of their fellow workers were actively monitoring them. Marcus Webb appeared wherever they went, always with a friendly smile, but eyes that never showed genuine warmth. Sarah Kim asked probing questions about their activities, her conversations feeling like interrogations disguised as casual friendship. Jake tried to warn other recent arrivals, but found they were becoming less receptive to concerns about the facility. Workers who'd been there 4 weeks or longer showed no interest in escape plans or outside contact. They seemed genuinely content with their situation, praising the work environment and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to be part of Northwind's success. The compound was changing them systematically. Jake could feel it in himself, a gradual shift in priorities and perspectives. Tasks that seemed boring during his first week now felt satisfying and important. The cold that had initially bothered him was no longer noticeable. He found himself working longer shifts without fatigue, his efficiency ratings climbing to match the veteran workers. Most frightening was the growing sense that his life before the cannery was becoming distant and unimportant. Memories of family and friends felt like stories about someone else. Plans for the future seemed irrelevant compared to the satisfaction of perfectly processed seafood and optimized workflow systems. Tony lasted longer than Jake, maintaining his resistance through sheer determination and careful avoidance of the cafeteria food. But by the 8th week, even he began to change. His attempt to contact the outside world became less frequent. His escape plans grew less urgent. He started praising the efficiency of Northwind's operations and expressing appreciation for the valuable skills he was learning. Jake's final moment of clarity came during his 10th week at the facility. He found himself in the laboratory where they'd first discovered the truth about project preservation. But instead of feeling horror or anger, he felt pride. The research was important work. The improvements to human capability were remarkable achievements. The compound wasn't destroying their humanity, it was perfecting it. He updated his own medical file, noting the successful completion of psychological integration. His resistance to the treatment had been overcome through patient application of the prescribed protocol. He was ready for permanent assignment to Northwind Processing, where he would help train future test subjects in the optimal techniques for seafood processing and facility maintenance. The boat that brought new workers arrived every 2 months, carrying fresh test subjects who would undergo the same transformation Jake had experienced. Some resisted longer than others, but the compound was patient and inexorable. Within 12 weeks, every worker became a permanent asset of Northwind Processing, their previous lives erased and replaced with perfect dedication to the facility's mission. Jake's family received notification that their son had decided to extend his contract indefinitely due to exceptional career opportunities. The letter, written in handwriting that perfectly matched Jake's style, expressed gratitude for their support and explained that communication would be limited due to the remote location and demanding work schedule. Similar letters were sent to the families of every worker who disappeared into Northwind Processing. The cannery maintained its reputation as an excellent employer that offered life-changing opportunities for dedicated workers. Recruitment continued year-round, bringing fresh subjects to the facility, where they would join the growing population of perfectly efficient, eternally content employees who could no longer remember why they'd ever wanted to leave. Story 4. The Pilot of the Confusion Zone. Captain Dale Mackenzie had been flying bush planes in Alaska for 22 years without incident. He'd navigated through whiteout conditions, landed on glaciers during storms, and delivered supplies to villages that existed as barely a dot on aviation charts. His reputation for reliability made him the preferred pilot for charter companies throughout the state, which is why Arctic Express Aviation didn't hesitate to assign him the Kantishna run on November 8, 2018. The flight should have been routine. Pick up 3 researchers from a remote geological survey site near Denali National Park, fly them back to Fairbanks. Weather conditions were ideal, with clear skies and minimal wind. Dale's Cessna 180 was in perfect mechanical condition, recently serviced, and equipped with redundant navigation systems. The flight plan estimated 2 hours total flying time. Dale took off from Fairbanks at 1:15 p.m., maintaining radio contact with air traffic control as he flew southwest toward the pickup coordinates. The researchers had been studying permafrost changes in the region for 6 months and were scheduled to return to the University of Alaska with their findings. Dale had flown the same route dozens of times and could navigate it by landmark recognition alone. At 2:47 p.m., Dale's last transmission to air traffic control reported his position as 15 miles northeast of the pickup site, with an estimated arrival time of 3:05 p.m. The transmission was clear and routine, showing no signs of distress or mechanical problems. After that, Captain Dale Mackenzie and his aircraft vanished from all radar and radio contact. The search began immediately when Dale failed to arrive at the pickup site. Alaska Air National Guard deployed search and rescue teams across a 100-square-mile area, using helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and ground crews to scan for any sign of the missing plane. Weather conditions remained perfect throughout the 3-day search operation, eliminating the possibility that Dale had been forced down by sudden storms or visibility problems. On the 4th day, a National Guard helicopter crew spotted wreckage in a valley, approximately 40 miles southeast of Dale's last known position. The Cessna 180 had apparently crashed into rocky terrain at high speed, with debris scattered across several hundred yards. The impact site showed no evidence of fire or explosion, suggesting mechanical failure or pilot error as possible causes. Dale's body was found in the wreckage, killed instantly on impact. The 3 researchers he'd been sent to collect were discovered at their survey site, unharmed but confused about why their scheduled pickup had never arrived. They'd maintained radio watch throughout Dale's expected arrival window, but had heard no distress calls or communication attempts. The investigation should have been straightforward, but Dale's recorder contained information that made no sense. According to the device's timestamps and GPS coordinates, Dale had been flying for over 6 hours before the crash, covering more than 800 miles of terrain that didn't exist on any aviation chart. The voice recordings were even more disturbing. For the first hour of flight, Dale's communications were normal, reporting weather conditions and navigation updates to air traffic control. But after his final transmission to Fairbanks ATC, the recorder captured 4 hours of one-sided conversations with an unknown party. Fairbanks Control, this is November 448 Delta Charlie. I'm showing some unusual terrain features ahead. Can you confirm my position? Dale's voice was steady but confused. No response was audible on the recording, but Dale continued as if receiving instructions. Roger that. I'll maintain current heading and altitude. Can you explain the landscape changes I'm observing? For the next several minutes, Dale described geographical features that didn't exist in Alaska or anywhere else on Earth. Crystalline formations rising from perfectly flat plains. Geometric patterns in the landscape that appeared to be artificial constructions. Rivers that flowed uphill, and forests where every tree was identical in size and spacing. Control, I'm seeing movement on the ground now. Large formations of... I'm not sure how to describe them. They look like people, but they're moving in perfect synchronization. Hundreds of them, arranged in geometric patterns that shift and change as I watch. Dale's voice grew increasingly strained as he reported impossible observations. Towns and cities laid out in perfect mathematical precision, with architecture that seemed to defy physics. Vehicles or creatures moving in coordinated patterns across vast distances. Weather systems that formed geometric shapes in the sky. Control, something's wrong with my instruments. Compass is spinning freely. GPS shows coordinates that don't exist. Altimeter readings are fluctuating wildly. But I can see the ground clearly and I'm maintaining stable flight. Request vectors to nearest airport. The recording captured Dale's growing confusion as his instruments failed to match his visual observations. He reported flying over landscapes that changed from Arctic tundra to tropical forests to desert wasteland within minutes. He described seeing multiple suns in the sky, or aurora displays during broad daylight, or weather patterns that moved in straight lines rather than natural curves. "I'm getting low on fuel, but my fuel gauges show full tanks. This doesn't make sense. I should have enough fuel for the return flight, but I've been flying for hours longer than planned. The terrain below doesn't match my charts. I don't recognize any landmarks." Most disturbing were Dale's descriptions of the synchronized figures he observed on the ground throughout his flight. Thousands of humanoid shapes moving in complex patterns across the landscape, all perfectly coordinated as if controlled by a single intelligence. They appeared to be constructing massive geometric structures, or perhaps performing some kind of ritual or ceremony on a continental scale. "Control, the figures on the ground are looking up at me now, all of them, simultaneously. They've stopped their activities and turned their faces toward my aircraft. I can't see individual features from this altitude, but I have the distinct feeling they're communicating with each other about my presence." Dale's final hour of recorded flight showed increasing panic as his fuel situation became critical, and the landscape below offered no recognizable landmarks or suitable landing sites. His descriptions became more frantic as he realized he was lost in an impossible geography that couldn't exist. "I'm going to attempt an emergency landing. There's what looks like a flat area ahead, though the ground appears to be moving or shifting in some way. Control, if you can hear this, please notify my family that this wasn't pilot error. Something happened to me up here that I can't explain. The world I'm flying through isn't the one I took off from." The recorder captured the sound of impact, but also something else that crash investigators couldn't explain. In the moments before the plane hit the ground, Dale's voice could be heard one final time, but he wasn't speaking to air traffic control or making emergency declarations. He was speaking to someone or something else entirely. "I understand now. You were showing me what's really here, underneath what we think we see. The patterns, the coordination, the purpose behind it all. I'm sorry I intruded on your work. I didn't know this space was occupied." The investigation concluded that Dale Mackenzie had suffered some form of spatial disorientation or hypoxia-induced hallucination that caused him to fly far off course before crashing. The recordings were classified as evidence of pilot incapacitation, possibly caused by undetected carbon monoxide poisoning or other medical emergency. But the GPS data from Dale's flight recorder told a different story. The coordinates showed his aircraft traveling through airspace that corresponded to no location on Earth. The elevation readings indicated flight altitudes below sea level, then above the stratosphere, then underground. The timestamps suggested he'd been flying through multiple time zones simultaneously, experiencing hours of flight time within minutes of real-world duration. Arctic Express Aviation quietly retired Dale's tail number and route designation. The geological survey site where the researchers had been working was abandoned, with official reports citing budget constraints and completed research objectives. The researchers themselves were reassigned to different projects and signed comprehensive non-disclosure agreements regarding their experiences in the region. Local pilots began reporting navigation anomalies in the area where Dale had disappeared.
Compass deviations, GPS errors, and radio interference became common enough that the Federal Aviation Administration issued advisories about electronic equipment malfunctions in what became unofficially known as the confusion zone. Pilots were advised to use visual navigation and maintain constant radio contact when flying through the region. Some pilots claimed to have glimpsed the same impossible landscapes Dale had described: geometric patterns in the wilderness, synchronized movements on the ground, and weather phenomena that violated natural laws. But these reports were dismissed as suggestion and folklore, the kind of stories that spread among aviators who spent too much time alone in empty skies. Dale Mackenzie's flight recorder remains in federal custody, its contents classified under aviation safety regulations. His family received standard death benefits and a commendation for his years of exemplary service. The official cause of the crash was listed as pilot error due to medical incapacitation, a conclusion that satisfied insurance companies and regulatory agencies. But in the small community of Alaska bush pilots, Dale's story became a cautionary tale about places where the sky itself can lie to you, where navigation instruments fail, not because they're trying to measure something that exists outside normal space and time. They speak of the confusion zone as a place where reality wears thin, where careful pilots can glimpse the hidden architecture that lies beneath the world we think we know. Story 5. Beneath Lake Chilotna. Marina Petrov had been ice fishing for 15 years, but she'd never seen anything like the structure beneath Lake Chilotna. What started as a routine winter fishing trip in February 2019 became an encounter with something that challenged everything she understood about Alaska's natural history and the things that might live beneath its frozen lakes. Marina drove to Lake Chilotna on a Friday morning, planning to spend the weekend in her heated ice shelter, fishing for northern pike and lake trout. The lake was popular with local anglers, known for its deep, clear waters and reliable fish populations. Marina had fished there dozens of times and knew the best spots along the lake's eastern shore. She set up her shelter in 30 feet of water, using her fish finder to locate the thermocline where large fish typically congregated during winter months. The ice was 18 inches thick, perfect for safe fishing, and her auger cut through it cleanly. Marina dropped her lines and settled in for what she expected to be a relaxing weekend of solitude and hopefully good fishing. The fish finder showed normal underwater topography for the first several hours. The lake bed was visible at 42 feet, with scattered debris and the occasional fish signature moving through the water column. But around 2 p.m., Marina noticed something unusual on the sonar display. What appeared to be a large geometric structure was visible on the lake bottom, roughly 60 feet from her fishing hole. Marina had never seen this structure before, despite fishing this exact location multiple times. The sonar showed what looked like walls or platforms arranged in precise angles, too regular to be natural rock formations. The stones were about 20 feet across and rose several feet from the lake bed, creating shadows and hiding places where fish might congregate. Curious about this potential new fishing spot, Marina decided to investigate. She put on her underwater camera system,
a waterproof unit designed for ice fishing that could be lowered through the fishing hole to record underwater conditions. The camera would allow her to see what her fish finder was detecting and potentially locate fish that might be hiding around the mysterious structure. Marina lowered the camera slowly, watching its feed on her portable monitor. The water was surprisingly clear for winter, with visibility extending much further than usual for Lake Chalatna. As the camera descended, Marina could see fish moving through the water column, but they seemed to be avoiding the area directly above the structure her sonar had detected. At 35 feet, the camera's lights illuminated something that made Marina's breath catch. The structure wasn't natural rock formation or sunken debris. It was clearly artificial, constructed from fitted stone blocks that showed evidence of careful craftsmanship. The stones were covered with intricate carvings that appeared to be symbols or hieroglyphics, though they didn't match any native Alaskan artistic styles Marina recognized. The structure was larger than her sonar had indicated, extending beyond the camera's light range in multiple directions. What Marina had thought was a single building or platform was apparently part of a much larger complex of connected structures. The architecture was unlike anything she had seen, with curved walls that flowed into straight edges and openings that seemed to serve as doorways or windows into dark interior spaces. Marina maneuvered the camera around the structure's perimeter, trying to understand its scope and purpose. The craftsmanship was remarkable, with stones fitted together so precisely that no mortar appeared to be necessary. The carvings covered every surface, depicting scenes that might have been historical events, religious ceremonies, or astronomical observations. Some symbols appeared to be star maps, showing constellation patterns that Marina didn't recognize. As Marina continued filming, she noticed movement within the structure's dark openings. At first, she thought it might be fish seeking shelter, but the shapes she glimpsed didn't move like any aquatic life she knew. They were elongated and serpentine in shape, moving with fluid grace through the water in ways that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random fish behavior. Marina zoomed the camera toward the structure's larger opening, hoping to get a clearer view of whatever was moving inside. The camera's lights penetrated about 10 feet into the interior, revealing corridor-like spaces with more carved walls and what appeared to be additional chambers extending deeper into the structure. The movement she detected was more pronounced now, with multiple serpentine forms gliding through the interior spaces. Then one of the creatures approached the camera directly. Marina watched in fascination and growing fear as a being unlike anything she had ever seen came into clear view. It was roughly humanoid in basic shape, but adapted for aquatic life, with elongated limbs that ended in webbed appendages and a face that was hauntingly beautiful despite its alien features. Its skin appeared to be translucent, showing internal structures that pulsed with bioluminescent light. The being examined Marina's camera with obvious intelligence, manipulating it gently with its appendages to view it from different angles. Its large eyes showed curiosity rather than aggression, and its movements suggested a level of technological understanding that was deeply unsettling. This wasn't a primitive life form. It was a being with advanced capabilities investigating human technology. Marina's fishing line jerked violently, nearly pulling her rod from its holder. She looked at her fish finder and saw multiple large signatures rising rapidly from the lake bottom. Something was coming up from the structure, and it was moving much faster than anything that should live in these waters. Marina tried to reel in her camera, but the line had become tangled or caught on something below. The first creature reached her fishing lines at 20 feet below the ice. Marina watched on her camera monitor as beings similar to the one she had first encountered began examining her fishing equipment with the same curious intelligence. They handled her hooks and lures carefully, seeming to understand their purpose while showing no fear of the sharp metal objects.
One of the creatures produced what appeared to be a carved hook, made from the same luminescent material as their skin. It was beautiful and intricate, covered with the same symbols Marina had seen on the underwater structure. The creature carefully attached its hook to Marina's fishing line, replacing her artificial lure with its own creation. Marina felt the weight change on her line and began reeling in whatever the creature had attached. The carved hook was unlike anything she'd ever seen, warm to the touch despite coming from the frigid lake water, and glowing with a soft internal light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. As Marina examined the hook, she became aware that the creatures below were still present around her camera. They weren't trying to damage her equipment or drive her away. They seemed to be studying her just as intently as she was studying them. The camera showed them pointing toward the surface, gesturing in ways that suggested they were discussing her presence. Marina tried to reel in her camera, but discovered that the creatures had attached additional items to her line. As she pulled up the equipment, she found several more carved objects. A small stone tablet covered with symbols, a piece of the same luminescent material shaped into a geometric form, and what appeared to be a miniature replica of the underwater structure. Each object was warm and glowing, and each seemed to contain some form of information or message. The stone tablet showed star patterns that changed configuration as Marina watched, displaying what might have been astronomical data or navigation information. The geometric form resonated with a barely audible musical tone that seemed to harmonize with itself in impossible ways. Marina realized that the creatures weren't just observing her, they were attempting to communicate. The objects they'd given her were some form of exchange, offering information about their civilization in response to her technology. But the implications of this contact were overwhelming. These beings had been living beneath Lake Chulotna for an unknown period, possibly centuries or millennia, maintaining an advanced civilization hidden beneath the ice. As the afternoon progressed, more creatures appeared around Marina's camera. Her fish finder showed dozens of signatures rising from the structure, and the camera revealed an entire community of the serpentine beings gathering to observe this unprecedented contact with surface dwellers. They moved in coordinated patterns around the underwater structure, their bioluminescent bodies creating complex light displays that might have been language or art or both. Marina documented everything she could, taking photographs of the objects the creatures had given her and recording video of their activities below the ice. But as evening approached, she began to feel a strange compulsion to join them beneath the surface. The carved hook pulsed with increasing intensity, and the symbols on the stone tablet seemed to be teaching her something about the being's way of life. The creature's bioluminescent displays became more elaborate as darkness fell, turning the underwater structure into a beacon that was visible even through 18 inches of ice. Marina found herself drilling additional holes, ostensibly to get better camera angles, but increasingly driven by an urge to create a larger opening in the ice. Marina's final video, recorded on her phone as backup documentation, showed her preparing to enter the water through the enlarged opening she'd created. She was still wearing her winter fishing gear, which should have made swimming impossible, but she seemed confident that the creatures below would ensure her safety. Her voice on the recording was calm and dreamy, as if she were in a trance state. "They've been waiting so long for contact. The symbols explain everything. They're not from here originally, but they've been guardians of this place for thousands of years. The structure is a repository of knowledge, a library of everything they've learned about this world and others. They want to share it, but only with someone who can understand the responsibility." Marina's truck was found the next morning by other anglers who recognized her vehicle. The ice fishing shelter was still set up, with equipment running and multiple holes drilled through the ice in a perfect geometric pattern. Marina's fishing gear was neatly arranged, and her catch of the day was cleaned and ready for transport. But Marina herself was nowhere to be found. The search and rescue operation lasted 5 days, with divers exploring the lake bottom and helicopters scanning the surrounding wilderness. They found no trace of Marina, but divers reported seeing unusual structures beneath the ice that weren't marked on any lake survey. The structures appeared to be covered with bioluminescent organisms that made accurate photography difficult. Marina's camera and video equipment were recovered from the lake bottom, but the memory cards contained only corrupted data that showed flashing lights and distorted images. The objects Marina had described in her final video were never found, though search teams reported finding unusually shaped pieces of carved stone near her fishing holes. Lake Chulotna was quietly closed to winter fishing the following season, with official explanations citing concerns about ice stability and fish population management. Local anglers were directed to other lakes in the region, and the access road to Chulotna was blocked with barriers that were never removed. But satellite imagery of the lake during winter months show unusual light patterns beneath the ice, geometric formations that pulse and shift in complex rhythms. Marine biologists who've studied the images suggest they might be caused by unique microorganism populations or unusual mineral deposits, but they can't explain why the patterns appeared to show purposeful design and coordination. Marina Petrov's disappearance remains officially classified as a drowning accident, despite the lack of any body recovery or evidence that she'd actually entered the water. Her family received standard death benefits, and her fishing equipment was returned after the investigation concluded. But her final video, though officially dismissed as evidence of hypothermia-induced hallucinations, continues to circulate among Alaska's fishing and outdoors communities as proof that some of the state's remote lakes harbor secrets that are better left undisturbed. Story 6. The Town That Vanished Overnight. In the summer of 1957, the village of Angoon Creek was thriving. Population 347, according to the last census, with a school, a general store, a post office, and a small airstrip that connected the community to the outside world.
The residents were a mix of native Alaskans, seasonal workers, and families who had settled in the region to work in logging and mining operations. By all accounts, it was a typical small Alaskan community, self-sufficient and tight-knit, where everyone knew their neighbors and life followed predictable seasonal rhythms. The mail plane arrived every Tuesday and Friday, delivering supplies, mail, and occasional passengers to the remote settlement. Pilot Ray Christensen had been flying the route for 12 years and knew every resident by name. On Friday, August 23, 1957, Ray landed at Angoon Creek, expecting the usual routine of unloading cargo and visiting with the locals who came to the airstrip to collect their mail and catch up on news from the outside world. Instead, Ray found the village completely deserted. The airstrip was empty, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes weather or community events kept people away from the mail plane's arrival. But as Ray taxied to his usual parking spot, he noticed other anomalies that made him increasingly uneasy. Smoke was rising from several chimneys, indicating that fires had been recently tended. Laundry hung on lines between houses, still damp and moving in the afternoon breeze. The general store's doors stood open, with merchandise visible on the shelves and the cash register drawer partially open. He called out as he walked through the village, announcing his arrival and asking if anyone needed assistance. His voice echoed through empty streets, but no one responded. He checked the school first, thinking classes might be in session, but found empty classrooms with lessons still written on blackboards and children's books open on desks as if students had just stepped outside for recess. The post office was equally disturbing. Mail was sorted and ready for distribution, with individual bundles prepared for each family in the community. The postmaster's logbook showed entries dated that morning, recording the arrival of supplies and noting several outgoing letters that residents had dropped off for Friday's mail pickup. But there was no sign of the postmaster or anyone else. Ray methodically checked every building in Angoon Creek, calling out names and searching for any indication of where the residents might have gone. Houses were unlocked, with meals half prepared on kitchen tables and coffee still warm in cups. Children's toys were scattered in yards as if games had been interrupted mid-play. The logging camp on the village's outskirts showed similar signs of sudden abandonment, with equipment running and trees partially cut, but no workers to be found. Most unsettling were the sled dogs. Every family in Angoon Creek kept dog teams for winter transportation, and the animals were still chained to their posts throughout the village. But all of them were dead, apparently from dehydration and starvation, suggesting they'd been abandoned for several days, despite the evidence that humans had been present that morning. Ray found the village's official records in the community center office, including detailed logs of daily activities, weather observations, and communications with the outside world. The final entries were dated August 23rd, the morning of his arrival, and described normal community activities. The school teacher had noted attendance for the morning session. The storekeeper had recorded several sales. The radio operator had logged routine communications with other settlements. But there were also strange entries in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Multiple residents had reported unusual dreams featuring the same imagery. Vast migrations of people walking across frozen landscapes towards distant lights. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that the village had held community meetings to discuss them, with some residents expressing concerns that they might be prophetic visions. Ray loaded his plane with the village's official records and several personal items that might help authorities identify what had happened to the residents. He took off from Angoon Creek that afternoon, promising himself he would return with help as soon as possible. But when he reached Fairbanks and reported the situation to territorial authorities, their response was skeptical and bureaucratic. The official investigation didn't begin for 2 weeks, delayed by jurisdictional questions and resource limitations. When authorities finally arrived at Angoon Creek, they found the village exactly as Ray had described, but with additional signs of deterioration. The fires had burned out, food had spoiled, and scavenging animals had begun claiming the abandoned settlement. Investigators could find no evidence of violence, natural disaster, or forced evacuation. Personal belongings were left behind, including valuable items that residents would have taken if they were relocating voluntarily. Vehicles were parked normally, with keys still in ignitions. Bank accounts showed no unusual withdrawals or financial preparations for departure. The federal investigation concluded that the residents of Angoon Creek had voluntarily abandoned their community for unknown reasons, possibly related to economic pressures or social conflicts not documented in official records. The case was classified as a mass migration event, unusual but not unprecedented in Alaska's remote settlements, where entire communities sometimes relocated in response to changing conditions. But the investigators' report contained several anomalies they couldn't explain. Footprint analysis around the village showed that the residents had walked away in organized groups, following specific routes that led into the wilderness, rather than toward any known transportation routes or neighboring settlements. The footprints were so numerous and overlapping that tracking them beyond the village boundaries was impossible. More disturbing was the discovery of additional abandoned villages throughout the region. Over the following months, investigators found 3 other small communities that had been deserted under similar circumstances, all within a 100-mile radius of Angoon Creek. Each showed the same pattern of sudden abandonment, with evidence of normal activities interrupted, but no signs of distress or preparation for departure. The territorial government quietly removed Angoon Creek and the other abandoned settlements from official maps and records. The communities were redesignated as uninhabitable due to geographic isolation, and their former locations were marked as wilderness areas unsuitable for future development. Mail routes were adjusted to skip the abandoned settlements, and aerial surveys were conducted to ensure no one attempted to reoccupy the sites. But the disappearances didn't end in 1957. Over the following decades, hikers and hunters reported finding other deserted communities throughout Alaska's interior, all showing the same characteristics as Angoon Creek. Houses left with meals on tables, equipment abandoned mid-use, and no indication of where the residents had gone or why they'd left everything behind. Local Native Alaskan communities began sharing stories about the walking time, a prophetic period when entire villages would hear the call to join a great migration toward spiritual destinations beyond the physical world. The stories described dreams and visions that would come to whole communities simultaneously, showing them pathways to other realms where they would continue their existence in harmony with spiritual forces. Modern satellite surveillance has identified dozens of abandoned settlements throughout Alaska's remote regions, many of which never appeared on official maps or government records. The sites show evidence of recent habitation, but no current human presence, as if entire communities continue to vanish without explanation or investigation. In winter months, when atmospheric conditions are right, aircraft flying over these abandoned settlements report seeing lights and smoke rising from buildings that satellite imagery confirms are empty and deteriorating. Some pilots describe seeing groups of people moving through the communities, going about daily activities as if the villages were still inhabited. But landing investigations always reveal the same empty buildings and deserted streets that Ray Christensen first discovered in Angoon Creek.
Story 7. The Blackout Cabin of Talkeetna. The cabin rental listing on Craigslist seemed too good to be true. 2 bedrooms, fully furnished, wood stove heating and generator electricity for just $200 per month during the winter season. The only catch was a shared lease agreement requiring 3 tenants to split costs and maintain the property. For seasonal workers Tommy Chan, Lisa Morrison, and Jake Rodriguez, who needed housing near their jobs at the Talkeetna winter tourism operations, the deal was perfect. The cabin sat on 5 acres of wooded land about 8 miles outside Talkeetna proper, accessible by a gravel road that required 4-wheel drive during winter months. The property had been a hunting lodge in the 1980s before being converted to seasonal rental housing. The landlord, Carl Evenson, met them at the property in early December 2020 to hand over keys and explain the basics of rural Alaska living. Carl was in his 70s, a longtime Alaska resident who owned several rental properties throughout the region. He showed them how to operate the generator, maintain the wood stove, and manage the propane systems that provided cooking fuel and backup heating. The cabin was comfortable and well-maintained, with modern amenities that made winter living manageable despite the remote location. "Only thing you need to know," Carl mentioned as he prepared to leave, "is the power cuts out every night at 3:15. Generator just stops running no matter what you do. Starts right back up in the morning. Never had any problems with it mechanically. Just one of those quirks old places sometimes have." Tommy asked if the power outage was related to an automatic timer or fuel management system, but Carl shook his head. "Nope, checked all that years ago. Had 3 different mechanics look at the generator, replace parts, even bought a whole new unit. Same thing happens every night, exactly 3:15 a.m. Power goes out, comes back on around dawn. You'll get used to it." The 3 roommates settled into the cabin routine quickly. Tommy worked at the Talkeetna winter sports rental shop, Lisa guided snowshoe tours for tourists, and Jake maintained trails for the local dog sledding operations. Their schedules meant someone was usually at the cabin during evening hours, and they took turns managing the wood stove and other maintenance tasks. The power outage Carl had mentioned proved to be exactly as described. Every night at 3:15 a.m., the generator stopped running with no warning or mechanical explanation. The silence was absolute and immediate, cutting off the subtle background noise of the electrical system and plunging the cabin into complete darkness. By morning, the generator would be running normally again, as if it had never stopped. For the first week, the nightly blackout was merely an inconvenience. The three roommates bought battery-powered lanterns and made sure to charge their devices before the power cut each night. The wood stove provided adequate heat, and the propane appliances continued working normally during the electrical outage. But on their 8th night in the cabin, Lisa woke during the blackout period and noticed something that made her question whether they were truly alone on the property. Looking out her bedroom window, she could see shapes moving through the darkness between the trees surrounding the cabin. The shapes were tall and moved with purpose, as if they were patrolling the perimeter or conducting some kind of organized activity. Lisa woke Tommy and Jake to show them what she was seeing, but by the time they reached the windows, the shapes had disappeared. They checked the property with flashlights, but found no footprints or other evidence that anyone had been outside. Tommy suggested that Lisa had seen deer or other wildlife, which was common in the area, though Lisa insisted the shapes had been moving in ways that suggested human intelligence. The next night, all three roommates stayed awake during the blackout period to watch for the mysterious shapes Lisa had described. At 3:15 a.m., the generator stopped as usual, and within minutes they began seeing movement in the forest around the cabin. The shapes were definitely humanoid, tall and thin, moving between trees in coordinated patterns that suggested organized activity rather than random wildlife behavior. Tommy tried to get a better view by opening the front door, but as soon as he stepped onto the porch, all movement in the forest stopped instantly. The shapes seemed to fade into the darkness as if they were aware of being observed. When Tommy retreated inside and closed the door, the movement resumed within minutes, suggesting that the figures were monitoring the cabin's occupants as closely as they were being watched. Jake suggested they might be seeing other people who lived in the area, possibly hunters or trappers who were active during nighttime hours, but Lisa pointed out that the shapes never used flashlights or made any of the noise that human activity would typically generate. They moved through dense forest with complete silence, navigating obstacles that would be nearly impossible to traverse in absolute darkness without artificial lighting. The phenomenon continued every night, with the mysterious figures appearing during the blackout period and disappearing before dawn when the generator resumed operation. The roommates documented the activity, taking photographs and videos with their phones, but the darkness was too complete for their camera equipment to capture useful images of the moving shapes. After 2 weeks of nightly observations, the three roommates realized that the figures seemed to be getting closer to the cabin each night. What had initially been movement visible only in the distant tree line was now occurring within 50 yards of their windows. The shapes appeared to be conducting systematic surveys of the property, examining the cabin's exterior, outbuildings, and even their vehicles. Most disturbing was the discovery that the figures left no traces of their presence. Snow around the cabin showed no footprints, despite clear evidence that the shapes had moved within feet of the building's walls. There were no broken branches, disturbed vegetation, or other signs that anyone had been walking through the forest areas where they'd observed the mysterious activity. Tommy decided to confront the situation directly by staying outside during the next blackout period. Despite Lisa and Jake's concerns for his safety, he positioned himself on the cabin's porch with a powerful flashlight, determined to get a clear view of whatever was moving through the darkness around their home. At 3:15 a.m., the generator stopped and the property plunged into darkness. Tommy immediately turned on his flashlight and began scanning the forest perimeter, calling out to identify himself as a resident of the property. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then the movement began, but instead of the distant shapes they'd observed from inside the cabin, Tommy found himself surrounded by dozens of tall, thin figures standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. The figures were motionless and silent, arranged in a perfect circle around the cabin, with Tommy at the center. He could see their outlines clearly enough to determine that they were roughly human in shape, but wrong in proportions, with limbs that were too long and posture that suggested they were observing him with the same curiosity he'd been directing toward them. Tommy tried to approach one of the figures, but as he moved in any direction, they retreated at exactly the same pace, maintaining their circular formation while keeping him centered. His flashlight beam seemed to stop short of illuminating them clearly, as if the darkness around the figures was denser than normal shadow and absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Jake and Lisa watched from inside the cabin as Tommy conducted what appeared to be a slow-motion dance with invisible partners. They could see him moving in different directions and hear him calling out questions, but from their perspective he appeared to be alone on the property. The mysterious shapes that had been visible through their windows for 2 weeks were no longer apparent when observed from inside the building. After an hour of this standoff, Tommy returned to the cabin with a disturbing report. The figures hadn't threatened him or attempted any form of communication, but their presence had been overwhelming. He described feeling watched by dozens of intelligences that were definitely not human, but showed clear signs of organization and purpose. "They're studying us," Tommy told his roommates. "The way they move, the way they position themselves, it's like they're conducting research or surveillance. They know we're here, they know our routines, and they're documenting everything we do." The 3 roommates decided to research the cabin's history, hoping to find explanations for the nightly phenomena they were experiencing. Lisa contacted Carl Evanson, asking about previous tenants and any unusual incidents associated with the property. Carl was reluctant to discuss details, but eventually admitted that most renters didn't stay for full lease periods. People get spooked, nothing dangerous, mind you, just unsettling. Property's been like that since I bought it in '93. Previous owner mentioned similar things, said it started after he built the cabin. Something about the location draws attention, but it's harmless attention as far as I can tell. Carl provided contact information for several previous tenants, and Lisa spent days tracking down people who had rented the cabin over the past decades. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Every tenant reported the same nightly power outages, the same mysterious shapes moving through the darkness, and the same feeling of being constantly observed by invisible presences. Most former tenants had left within a month, unable to cope with the psychological stress of nightly surveillance by unknown entities. A few had stayed longer, usually seasonal workers like Tommy, Lisa, and Jake, who needed affordable housing more than they needed peace of mind. But even long-term tenants eventually relocated, citing the cumulative effect of never feeling truly alone or private on the property. One former tenant, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had lived in the cabin during the winter of 2018, provided additional disturbing details about the mysterious figures. According to Sarah, the entities weren't content with external observation. During her final weeks at the property, she'd begun seeing them inside the cabin during blackout periods, standing motionless in corners or doorways, watching her sleep or conduct daily activities. They don't interact with you directly, but you know they're there. You can feel them watching, evaluating, maybe learning about human behavior. I started sleeping with lights on, but that just made it worse because I could see their shadows moving when they shouldn't be able to cast shadows. Sarah's account prompted Lisa to pay closer attention to the cabin's interior during blackout periods. Using a small flashlight, she began conducting nightly surveys of the rooms, looking for the same mysterious presences that had driven Sarah to abandon her lease early. On her third night of interior monitoring, Lisa discovered that Sarah's experiences were continuing with new tenants. Tall, thin shapes were visible in the cabin's rooms during blackout periods, standing perfectly still in locations where they could observe human activity without interfering. They appeared to be taking turns, with different figures positioned throughout the house to maintain comprehensive surveillance. Lisa woke Tommy and Jake to confirm what she was seeing, and all three roommates spent the remainder of that blackout period documenting the interior presences. The figures didn't respond to questions or attempts to communication, but they clearly reacted to being observed. When watched directly, they remained motionless. When the roommates looked away or left a room, the figures repositioned themselves for better observation angles. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance became unbearable within days. The three roommates found themselves modifying their behavior to account for invisible observers, avoiding activities that felt too private or personal to conduct under unknown scrutiny. Sleep became difficult, as they could never be certain whether figures were standing beside their beds during blackout periods. Tommy, Lisa, and Jake abandoned their lease after 6 weeks, forfeiting their security deposit and breaking their rental agreement to escape the nightly intrusion of mysterious entities. Carl Evanson wasn't surprised by their early departure and returned their security deposit without argument. He listed the cabin for rent again within days, advertising the same attractive rates and downplaying the property's unusual characteristics. The cycle continued with new tenants who would discover the same nightly phenomena and face the same choice between affordable housing and psychological comfort. The cabin remains occupied seasonally by workers who need cheap housing more than they need explanations for its unusual characteristics. Some local researchers have attempted to study the phenomena, but the entities seem to avoid properties when scientific equipment is present. The figures appear only for normal residential occupancy, suggesting they're specifically interested in natural human behavior rather than controlled observation or investigation. Story 8. The Whispers in the Permafrost. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline Project employed thousands of workers during its construction in the 1970s, but the crew assigned to Section 47 near Prudhoe Bay encountered something that wasn't mentioned in any environmental impact study or geological survey. What started as routine permafrost drilling became an encounter with voices from the past that refused to stay buried beneath Alaska's frozen ground. Crew Chief Mike Sullivan had supervised pipeline construction for 3 years, managing teams that laid pipe across some of the most challenging terrain in North America. The work was dangerous and demanding, but the pay was exceptional, and the project offered steady employment for skilled workers willing to endure Alaska's harsh conditions. Section 47 was supposed to be straightforward: drill through permafrost, install support pilings, and continue the pipeline route toward its final destination. The drilling began on October 15, 1975, using specialized equipment designed to penetrate permanently frozen ground. The permafrost in this region was estimated to be several hundred feet thick, requiring careful heat management to avoid environmental damage while creating stable foundations for pipeline infrastructure. Mike's crew of 12 men had completed similar work on dozens of previous sections without unusual incidents. The first anomaly occurred when they reached 80 feet below surface level. The drilling equipment encountered what appeared to be an air pocket or void space within the permafrost, causing sudden pressure release and equipment malfunction. This was unusual but not precedented, as permafrost could contain various types of inclusions formed during ancient freeze-thaw cycles. When the crew examined the drill core samples, they found something that wasn't supposed to exist in permanently frozen ground. Mixed with ice and soil were organic materials that appeared to be wood fragments, textile fibers, and other debris suggesting human habitation. But carbon dating would later indicate the materials were far older than any known human presence in northern Alaska. More disturbing was the air that escaped from the pocket they'd breached. It carried sounds that resembled human voices, speaking in languages none of the crew recognized. The voices were faint and distorted, as if traveling through vast distances or filtering through dense material, but they were clearly articulate speech rather than natural wind or equipment noise. Drilling supervisor Frank Martinez was the first to notice that the voices seemed to be responding to their work activities. When the drill was running, the voices were louder and more agitated. When the crew stopped for breaks, the sounds became softer and more conversational, as if whoever was speaking had noticed the change in activity and adjusted their behavior accordingly. "It's like there's a whole conversation going on down there," Frank told Mike during their evening report. "Not just random sounds, but organized discussion. Sometimes it sounds like arguments, sometimes like people giving directions or making plans. And I swear they're reacting to what we're doing up here." Mike was skeptical until he spent an entire shift monitoring the sounds personally. The voices were definitely present, emerging from the borehole whenever air pressure allowed them to reach the surface. They spoke in rhythmic patterns that suggested organized language, with different vocal tones indicating multiple speakers engaged in complex discussions. The crew began documenting the phenomenon, recording the voices and attempting to identify patterns or meanings in their speech. Linguist Dr. Sarah Chen, who was consulting on environmental impact issues for the pipeline project, analyzed their recordings and concluded that the voices represented at least 3 distinct languages, none of which matched any known native Alaskan dialects or historical linguistic patterns. The vocalizations show characteristics of structured communication, grammar, syntax, emotional inflection, and conversational turn-taking that indicates intelligent discourse. But the languages don't correspond to any documented human speech patterns, either contemporary or historical. As the drilling continued deeper into the permafrost, more voice phenomena emerged from additional pockets they'd breached. Each new drilling site released different voices, sometimes speaking the same unknown languages, but often introducing new linguistic patterns entirely. By the end of their second week, the crew was listening to what sounded like dozens of individuals engaged in complex community discussions. Other crew members began reporting similar experiences, their own voices calling to them from beneath the ice, repeating conversations or making statements they'd never actually spoken. The mimicry became increasingly sophisticated, with the underground voices capturing not just speech patterns, but emotional tones and personal mannerisms that were uniquely individual. The psychological pressure of hearing their own voices echoing from beneath the permafrost began affecting the crew's performance and morale. Workers became reluctant to speak near the drilling sites, afraid that their words would be copied and repeated by whatever intelligence existed in the frozen ground. Some crew members requested transfers to other pipeline sections, citing the stress of constant audio surveillance by unknown entities. Mike consulted with pipeline project managers about the unusual phenomena, but received instructions to continue work according to schedule. The voices weren't interfering with actual construction activities, and the project's timeline couldn't accommodate delays for investigating unexplained acoustics. The crew was advised to ignore the sounds and focus on their drilling objectives. But ignoring the voices became impossible when they began providing information about the pipeline project that the underground speakers shouldn't have known. During their fourth week of drilling, the voices started discussing construction schedules, equipment specifications, and engineering details that were contained only in confidential project documentation. The conversations revealed intimate knowledge of pipeline routing decisions, environmental impact assessments, and corporate management strategies that even Mike's crew didn't have access to. The voices spoke about construction problems before they occurred, predicted equipment failures with precise accuracy, and discussed personnel changes days before official announcements. They know things about this project that they couldn't possibly know. Technical details, management decisions, even personal information about crew members' families and backgrounds. It's like they have access to all our records and communications, but they're getting the information from somewhere underground. Project Security investigated the possibility of espionage or unauthorized information access, but found no evidence that confidential documents had been compromised. The voices appeared to be obtaining information through unknown means, possibly by intercepting communications or accessing data systems through methods that conventional security couldn't detect. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen analyzed the linguistic patterns of the voices discussing technical information. She discovered that they weren't speaking in the unknown languages they'd used previously, but were communicating in a mixture of English and technical jargon that perfectly matched pipeline project documentation. They're not just mimicking individual speech patterns, Dr. Chen explained. They're synthesizing information from multiple sources and creating new conversations based on data they're somehow accessing. It's as if there's an intelligence down there that can tap into our information systems and use that data to generate realistic human conversations. The implications were disturbing enough that Pipeline Project Management decided to relocate Section 47 construction to a different route, officially citing geological instability in the permafrost. The drilling sites were sealed and marked as unsuitable for construction, with official reports attributing the decision to environmental protection concerns. But the crew members who worked Section 47 never forgot the experience of hearing their own voices calling to them from beneath Alaska's frozen ground. Some reported continuing to hear the underground conversations in dreams, as if their minds had been permanently linked to whatever intelligence existed in the permafrost. Dave Kim left the pipeline project after Section 47, unable to cope with the psychological impact of hearing his voice used by unknown entities.
He eventually moved to the lower 48 states, but continued to report hearing underground voices at construction sites throughout his career. The phenomenon followed him wherever he went, as if his exposure to the permafrost entities had created a permanent connection. Other crew members developed similar long-term effects. Frank Martinez began hearing voices in any deep excavation or underground construction project. Mike Sullivan reported that basements and subway tunnels triggered the same audio phenomena he had experienced during the pipeline drilling. All of them described hearing not just their own voices, but conversations between the underground entities discussing human activities with detailed knowledge they shouldn't possess. The official project records contain no mention of voice phenomena at Section 47, listing only routine geological challenges and standard construction procedures. But the crew members' experiences were documented in personal journals and private communications that paint a picture of systematic surveillance by intelligences that exist beneath Alaska's permanently frozen ground. Modern construction projects in northern Alaska continue to encounter similar phenomena when drilling through deep permafrost layers. Workers report hearing voices, equipment malfunctions that correlate with underground audio events, and the unsettling experience of having their conversations monitored and mimicked by entities that remain hidden beneath the ice. The permafrost voices represent one of Alaska's most persistent and widespread paranormal phenomena, affecting construction workers, researchers, and anyone who drills deep enough into the state's frozen ground to breach the chambers where these intelligences dwell. But despite decades of reports and documentation, the nature and origin of the underground entities remains as mysterious as it was when Mike Sullivan's crew first heard their voices calling to them from beneath the ice. Story 9. The Abandoned Gold Mine of Nome. In March 2019, 3 prospectors discovered something in the Seward Peninsula's abandoned mining tunnels that challenged everything they understood about Alaska's gold rush history and the things that might be hidden beneath the frozen ground. What began as an exploration of forgotten mining claims became an encounter with artifacts and phenomena that suggested Nome's gold deposits were connected to something far older and more mysterious than 19th century prospecting operations. Marcus Webb, David Chen, and Sarah Rodriguez had been recreational prospectors for over a decade, using metal detectors and small-scale mining equipment to search for gold in areas that commercial operations had overlooked. The Seward Peninsula around Nome was rich with abandoned claims and forgotten mining sites, many of which still contained recoverable amounts of precious metals that could be extracted using modern hobbyist techniques. The mine they discovered wasn't marked on any current maps or historical mining records. Marcus found the entrance while following an old trail that appeared to lead to water sources prospectors would have needed for their operations. The opening was partially concealed by decades of erosion and vegetation growth, but the worked stone around the entrance made it clear this was a human-made excavation rather than a natural cave formation. Initial exploration revealed a tunnel system that extended much deeper into the peninsula than typical placer mining operations would have required.
The construction was more sophisticated than most gold rush-era mining, with carefully fitted stone supports and drainage systems that suggested significant engineering expertise and long-term planning. The tunnels were dry and stable, despite being abandoned for an unknown period. About 200 feet into the main tunnel, the prospectors discovered the first anomaly that made them realize this wasn't a typical gold mining operation. The walls were covered with carved symbols and diagrams that bore no resemblance to any native Alaskan artistic traditions or European mining marks they had encountered. The carvings appeared to be star maps or astronomical charts showing constellation patterns and celestial relationships with mathematical precision. The symbols were accompanied by what appeared to be mining diagrams, but they depicted extraction techniques and geological relationships that didn't match 19th century mining knowledge or capabilities. The diagrams showed underground chambers connected by precise geometric patterns, with notations in unknown languages and mathematical formulas that used numerical systems the prospectors didn't recognize. David, who had studied geology in college, was particularly intrigued by the technical accuracy of the carved diagrams. These aren't primitive scratches. Someone with advanced understanding of geology and metallurgy created these. They show ore distribution patterns and extraction methods that are more sophisticated than anything gold rush miners would have known. Deeper in the tunnel system, the prospectors found chambers that had clearly been used for other purposes than gold extraction. Large rooms with carved walls and ceiling murals depicting scenes that might have been historical events, religious ceremonies, or astronomical observations. The artwork was remarkably well preserved, protected by the stable underground environment and dry conditions. The murals showed groups of people engaged in activities that combined mining operations with what appeared to be scientific or spiritual practices. Figures in the carvings were shown using tools and instruments that didn't match any known mining equipment, conducting ceremonies around geometric patterns carved into chamber floors, and observing celestial events from underground vantage points that shouldn't have provided sky access. Most intriguing were the carved time markers throughout the tunnel system. Stone calendars and astronomical calculations that appeared to track celestial cycles over periods of thousands of years, far predating any known human presence in the region. The mathematical precision of the calculations suggested advanced understanding of astronomy and long-term observational capabilities. Sarah, who worked as an accountant and had strong mathematical skills, spent hours documenting the numerical relationships depicted in the carvings. She explained, "These aren't random decorations. They're complex calculations involving planetary orbits, stellar positions, and time cycles that require sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Someone was tracking celestial events and using that information for purposes we don't understand." The prospectors' metal detectors indicated significant metallic deposits throughout the tunnel system, but not in patterns consistent with natural gold deposits or conventional mining operations. The metals appeared to be concentrated in specific chambers and arranged in geometric configurations that suggested intentional placement rather than natural geological processes. When they began excavating one of the indicated sites, Marcus, David, and Sarah discovered artifacts that revolutionized their understanding of the mind's purpose and origins. Buried beneath carefully arranged stones were metallic objects that appeared to be tools or instruments, but designed for purposes that weren't immediately apparent. The artifacts were made from metals that didn't match any materials the prospectors recognized. They were lightweight but extremely durable, with surfaces that seemed to resist tarnishing despite obvious age. Some objects appeared to be precision instruments with moving parts and calibration marks, while others might have been ceremonial items or artistic creations. Most remarkable was the discovery of what appeared to be a metallic star map, etched with incredible precision into a circular disk about 2 feet in diameter. The map showed stellar positions and constellation relationships, but from a perspective that didn't match Earth's view of the night sky. The stars were arranged in patterns that suggested the map was created from a different planetary vantage point, or depicted the sky as it would appear at a different time in astronomical history. As the prospectors continued their exploration, they began experiencing temporal anomalies that made them question their perception of time within the tunnel system. Activities that felt like they took hours were completed in minutes according to their watches. Conversations that seemed brief actually lasted for extended periods. The underground environment appeared to exist in a different temporal relationship than the surface world. David was the first to notice that their watches stopped working accurately while they were in the tunnels, showing different times despite being synchronized before entering the mine. Electronic devices behaved erratically, with GPS units showing impossible coordinates and digital cameras recording images that differed from what they observed directly. The temporal distortions became more pronounced the deeper they explored. In the furthest chambers, the prospectors experienced hours of exploration and documentation that their surface timeline suggested had occurred in mere minutes. They began to suspect that the mine's original creators had discovered or created conditions that altered the normal flow of time within the underground spaces. Sarah documented their experiences in detailed journals, noting the correlation between temporal anomalies and proximity to the metallic artifacts they'd discovered. The star map in particular seemed to be associated with the strongest temporal distortion effects, as if it were somehow regulating temporal flow within the chamber where it was located. Time moves differently around these artifacts, not just slower or faster, but according to different rules entirely. It's as if the metallic objects are connected to astronomical cycles that operate on scales we don't understand, and being near them synchronizes our perception with those larger temporal patterns. The prospectors' final discovery was the most disturbing, evidence that they weren't the first people to find the abandoned mine in recent years. Personal belongings and equipment from other explorers were scattered throughout the tunnel system, suggesting multiple individuals or groups had discovered the site and spent extended periods investigating its mysteries. But according to the dates on some of the abandoned equipment, previous explorers had been in the mine for weeks or months, even though their surface contacts showed no record of extended absences.
Journals left by other investigators described the same temporal anomalies and suggested that people could spend subjective months underground, while only hours or days passed in the outside world. Marcus, David, and Sarah realized they faced a decision that previous explorers had apparently struggled with: whether to continue investigating the mine's mysteries despite the temporal risks, or return to the surface and abandon their discoveries to protect their connection to normal time flow. The three prospectors chose to document everything they could and return to the surface, but agreed not to report their discoveries to authorities or publicize the mine's location. The temporal anomalies and advanced artifacts suggested technologies or phenomena beyond current scientific understanding, with implications that could be dangerous if mishandled by unprepared investigators. They sealed the mine entrance and marked its location privately, creating detailed maps and documentation that they stored separately in case future exploration became necessary. But all three continued to experience residual effects from their underground exposure, including persistent dreams about the star map and occasional temporal dislocations in their daily lives. David reported that clocks in his presence continued to show irregular behavior, running fast or slow without mechanical explanation. Sarah found that her subjective time periods didn't match objective measurements. Marcus experienced dreams that seemed to continue storylines from previous nights, as if his sleep was accessing extended narrative sequences that existed independently of normal dream cycles. The abandoned gold mine of Nome remained sealed and undisturbed, its location known only to the three prospectors who discovered its secrets. The artifacts and star maps wait in their underground chambers, along with evidence of astronomical knowledge and temporal manipulation technologies that predate known human civilization in Alaska by thousands of years. But the mine's influence continues to affect those who've encountered its mysteries, creating ongoing connections between human consciousness and whatever intelligence originally created the sophisticated underground complex.
Story 10. The Night of the Crimson Aurora. The residents of Kaktovik never forgot the night of February 14, 2017, when the aurora borealis burned red across the Arctic sky, and time itself seemed to stop in the small Inupiat village on Barter Island. What began as an unusual but beautiful display of northern lights became a community-wide experience that challenged everything the villagers understood about the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond. Kaktovik sits on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, home to about 250 people who maintain traditional subsistence lifestyles while adapting to modern Arctic conditions. The community is isolated, accessible only by air or sea, creating tight bonds among residents who depend on each other for survival in one of America's most remote locations. Aurora displays are common throughout the winter months, providing natural entertainment and spiritual significance for people who spend months in polar darkness. The aurora that appeared on February 14th was different from the beginning.
Instead of the typical green and blue lights that dance across the Arctic sky, the display showed deep crimson colors that pulsed in regular rhythms rather than flowing with the natural movements residents expected. The red lights were so intense they cast shadows on the snow, creating an otherworldly landscape that seemed more like Mars than Alaska. Elder Martha Kanguk was the first to notice that something was wrong with time during the aurora display. She had been checking her watch regularly while observing the lights, noting when different phases of the display began and ended. But at 11:47 p.m., every clock and watch in Koktovik stopped simultaneously, freezing at that exact moment while the aurora continued its crimson dance overhead. The time stoppage wasn't immediately apparent to everyone in the village. People continued their evening activities, watching the unusual aurora and discussing its remarkable color and intensity. But gradually, residents began to notice that electronic devices weren't updating. Digital clocks showed the same time no matter how long they watched, and mechanical timepieces had ceased their normal operation. More disturbing was the realization that the aurora's duration was impossible to measure. Residents who had been watching for what felt like 20 or 30 minutes discovered that their clocks still showed 11:47, suggesting either that time had stopped or that their perception of temporal flow had been altered. The crimson lights continued their rhythmic pulsing overhead, creating a hypnotic display that seemed to exist outside normal time constraints. Community health aide David Kaveoluk was conducting his nightly rounds when he encountered the first evidence that Koktovik was experiencing more than unusual aurora activity. Walking through the village center, David saw people in the streets who didn't belong to the current community. Figures dressed in traditional Inupiat clothing from earlier historical periods, moving through the village as if they were familiar residents going about their normal evening activities. The historical figures weren't transparent or ghostly in appearance. They looked as solid and real as current villagers, but their clothing, tools, and behavior indicated they were from different time periods spanning several centuries. Some wore traditional skin clothing that hadn't been commonly used for decades, while others dressed in early 20th century styles that reflected the community's transition to modern materials and methods. David attempted to interact with the temporal visitors, but discovered they seemed to exist in their own time periods rather than the present moment. When he called out to them, they didn't respond as if they couldn't hear him. When he approached them directly, they continued their activities without acknowledging his presence, as if he didn't exist in their temporal framework. Other villagers began reporting similar encounters throughout Koktovik. Current residents found themselves sharing streets and buildings with people from the community's past, all coexisting peacefully but unable to interact across temporal boundaries. The crimson aurora seemed to be creating conditions where different time periods overlapped in the same physical space. School principal Lisa Agiak documented the most detailed observations of the temporal overlap phenomena. From her home near the community center, Lisa could see multiple versions of Koktovik existing simultaneously. The current village, with its modern buildings and infrastructure, was occupied by present-day residents, but overlapping with historical versions of the community that showed different architectural layouts and population distributions. It was like looking at photographs from different decades, all printed on the same piece of paper, Lisa later wrote in her report to state authorities. I could see the village as it exists now, but also as it existed in the 1980s, the 1960s, even back to traditional settlements that predated permanent buildings. All the different time periods were there at once, with people from each era going about their normal activities. The temporal overlap wasn't limited to visual phenomena. Residents reported hearing conversations in traditional Inupiat dialects that were no longer commonly spoken, the sounds of traditional hunting and fishing activities, and the voices of deceased community members speaking as if they were still alive and present in the village. Traditionalist elder Robert Aiken recognized some of the voices as belonging to relatives and friends who had passed away years or decades earlier. The deceased speakers weren't communicating from beyond death, but seemed to be continuing conversations and activities from when they were alive, as if their living moments had been preserved and were now playing out simultaneously with current village life. My grandmother was there talking to my aunt about berry-picking plans for next summer. But my grandmother died in 1998, and my aunt died in 2003. They were having a conversation I remember from when I was a child, discussing places and people exactly as they were 40 years ago. They were alive in that moment, in that time, even though they're both buried in our cemetery. The crimson aurora continued for what residents subjectively experienced as 3 hours, though the stopped clocks made it impossible to verify the actual duration. During this period, Koktovik became a nexus where the community's entire history existed simultaneously, with past, present, and possibly future versions of the village occupying the same geographic space. Some residents reported seeing unfamiliar people who appeared to be future versions of current villagers or children they didn't recognize who might represent generations not yet born. The temporal overlap seemed to include not just historical periods, but potential future timelines, creating a complete temporal cross-section of the community's existence. The most profound experiences were reported by residents who encountered deceased family members during the aurora display. These weren't spiritual visitations or supernatural apparitions, but interactions with living versions of relatives preserved in temporal loops that the crimson lights had made accessible to current observation. Mary Kalik spent subjective hours walking through her childhood home as it existed in the 1970s, observing her parents and siblings at ages she remembered from her youth. The family members were engaged in daily activities that Mary recognized from specific memories, but they were living those moments in real time rather than as nostalgic recollections. It wasn't like remembering the past, Mary explained. It was like visiting the past while it was still happening. My father was working on hunting equipment. My mother was sewing. My brothers were playing games I remembered from when we were all children together. They were alive and present, existing in their own time, even though I knew they were gone from my time. The crimson aurora began to fade around what would have been 2:47 a.m. if time had been flowing normally. As the red lights gradually diminished, the temporal overlaps became less distinct, and the historical figures slowly faded from visibility. By the time the aurora completely disappeared, Koktovik had returned to its normal single timeline existence. At the moment the aurora ended, every stopped clock and watch in the village resumed operation, showing 2:47 a.m., as if 3 hours had passed normally. Electronic devices updated their displays. Mechanical timepieces continued their regular function, and digital systems showed no record of the temporal interruption that residents had experienced. The aftermath of the Crimson Aurora night left the Koktovik community profoundly changed. Residents had shared an experience that connected them directly to their village's history and to family members they thought they'd lost forever. The temporal overlap had provided healing opportunities for people to say goodbye to deceased relatives and to witness their community's cultural continuity across generations. But the experience also raised disturbing questions about the nature of time and death that challenged traditional Inupiat spiritual beliefs and scientific understanding alike. If past moments could be accessed and experienced as present reality, what did that mean for concepts of linear time and permanent loss? If deceased community members continued to exist in temporal loops, were they truly gone or simply relocated to different time coordinates? State authorities investigated reports of the Koktovik temporal anomaly, but found no scientific explanation for the phenomena residents described. Aurora activity on February 14, 2017 was noted as unusually intense and displaying rare red coloration, but none of the documented cases have been associated with the temporal anomalies Koktovik residents experienced, suggesting their crimson aurora represented phenomena beyond current scientific understanding. The night of February 14, 2017 remains unique in aurora observation records, both for its unusual coloration and for the community-wide temporal experiences it generated. Koktovik's encounter with accessible time loops and historical overlap continues to influence how residents understand their relationship to past and future generations, creating a living connection to cultural continuity that transcends conventional boundaries between past and present. Story 11: The Haunting at Bethel Hospital. The medical staff at Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta Regional Hospital in Bethel had grown accustomed to the challenges of providing health care in remote Alaska, but nothing in their training had prepared them for patient 247, a man who appeared on their computer systems but had never actually been admitted to the hospital. What began as a clerical error became a mystery that challenged everything the medical team understood about life, death, and the thin boundary between documented existence and physical reality. The first record of patient 247 appeared in the hospital's computer system on March 3, 2018. Entered by night shift supervisor Carol Tengusuk during routine data entry procedures. The patient was listed as Samuel Kanguk, age 67, admitted for pneumonia treatment with a bed assignment in Ward C, room 314. The entry appeared normal in every respect, matching the format and detail level of legitimate patient admissions. But when Carol checked room 314 during her rounds, she found it empty. The bed was made with fresh linens, The medical equipment showed no signs of recent use, and there were no personal belongings or medical charts indicating current occupancy. Carol assumed the admission had been entered incorrectly and made a note to correct the error during the next business day. The following morning, day shift nurse Lisa Chen discovered that patient 247's records had been updated overnight with detailed medical notes, medication schedules, and treatment plans that indicated active care by multiple staff members. The documentation was thorough and professional, showing blood pressure readings, temperature checks, medication administration, and physician consultations that should have required continuous bedside care. Lisa reviewed the previous night's staff assignments and discovered that 4 different medical personnel had apparently provided care to patient 247 during the overnight shift. But when she asked Carol about the patient, Carol insisted that room 314 had remained empty throughout her entire shift, with no admissions, discharges, or medical activities involving that bed assignment. Medical records supervisor David Nyok investigated the discrepancy and found that patient 247's file contained medical history dating back several years, showing previous admissions to Bethel Hospital for various conditions and treatments. The records were complete and detailed, referencing specific medical staff, procedures, and outcomes that appeared authentic in every respect. But when David cross-referenced the records with staff memories and archived documentation, he couldn't find anyone who remembered treating Samuel Kanguk or any verification that the medical encounters described in his file had actually occurred. Dr. Sarah Amanek, the hospital's chief of medicine, personally reviewed patient 247's medical records and found them to be professionally accurate and medically sound. These aren't fabricated records. Someone with extensive medical knowledge and access to our systems created documentation that meets professional standards for patient care. But the treatments described never happened, at least not in any way our staff remembers or our physical systems recorded. The mystery deepened when patient 247's records began updating in real time, showing ongoing medical care that hospital staff weren't providing. New vital signs appeared hourly. Medication administration was documented according to prescribed schedules, and physician notes recorded patient interactions and treatment responses that suggested active bedside care. Security footage of Ward C showed room 314 remaining empty throughout the periods when patient 247's records indicated he was receiving medical attention. Cameras captured nursing staff entering and leaving other rooms, but never showed anyone providing care to the unoccupied bed where Samuel Kanguk was supposedly recovering from pneumonia treatment. Charge nurse Martha Kanguk, who shared the same last name as patient 247, felt compelled to investigate whether Samuel might be a relative she didn't know about. Her research through tribal records and family genealogies revealed that Samuel Kanguk had been her grandfather's brother, a man who had died of pneumonia in 1947 at age 67, decades before Bethel Hospital existed in its current form. Martha's discovery added a disturbing historical dimension to the patient 247 mystery. The records show him receiving treatment for the same pneumonia that had killed him 70 years earlier, but with modern medical interventions and pharmaceutical treatments that hadn't been available during his original illness. The records show him getting antibiotics, oxygen therapy, and supportive care that might have saved his life if they'd existed in 1947, Martha explained.
It's like someone is providing him with the medical treatment he should have received, but decades after he actually needed it. Hospital Administrator Robert Chen consulted with the facility's information technology specialists to determine how unauthorized records were being created and updated in their secure computer systems. The IT investigation revealed that patient 247's entries were being generated from within the hospital's network, but from terminal access points that weren't physically located in any of the facility's buildings. The phantom terminal activity showed pattern signatures consistent with legitimate medical staff performing routine patient care duties. Someone who was creating the records was following proper protocols, using appropriate medical terminology, and demonstrating familiarity with hospital procedures that suggested they were trained healthcare professionals. More disturbing was the discovery that patient 247 wasn't the only phantom patient in Bethel Hospital's computer systems. IT specialists found dozens of similar records showing detailed medical care for patients who had no corresponding physical presence in the hospital. All of the phantom patients showed death dates that preceded the hospital's existence, but were receiving modern medical treatment for the conditions that had originally killed them. Jimmy had been hunting in the Arctic Ocean region for over 40 years and was intimately familiar with ice conditions, weather patterns, and the seasonal movements of marine wildlife. He'd never seen anything like the drifting village, and his first concern was for the safety of whoever might be living in such a precarious location. "We need to warn them about the ice conditions," Jimmy told his son. "That pack ice is moving toward open water, and those buildings will be in the ocean before morning if they don't evacuate immediately." David used his GPS to mark the village's location and attempted to contact Barrow Search and Rescue authorities, but discovered that his satellite communication equipment was malfunctioning. Radio calls weren't reaching any receiving stations, and his GPS was showing coordinates that placed them in impossible locations, far from land. The two hunters decided to approach the village directly to warn the residents about their dangerous situation. But as they traveled toward the settlement, they encountered spatial distortions that made navigation extremely difficult. The village appeared to be maintaining the same distance despite their steady progress toward it, as if it were moving away from them at exactly the speed they were approaching. After several hours of travel, Jimmy and David realized they were no longer on solid ice. Their snowmobiles were traveling across what appeared to be solid ground, with vegetation, hills, and geographic features that couldn't exist in the Arctic Ocean. The landscape around them had transformed into inland terrain that resembled traditional Inupiat hunting grounds from centuries past. The village was closer now, and they could see people moving between buildings and engaging in normal community activities. Children were playing traditional games in the spaces between houses. Adults were working on hunting equipment and household tasks, and elders were gathered around outdoor fires, engaged in conversations or storytelling activities. But something was wrong with the temporal characteristics of the scene. The people in the village were dressed in traditional clothing that hadn't been commonly used for decades, and their activities reflected subsistence practices that modern Arctic communities had largely replaced with contemporary methods and materials. David attempted to photograph the village with his phone, but discovered that his camera wasn't recording the scene he was observing directly. The images showed only empty ice fields, with no buildings or people,
despite the fact that he could clearly see an active community less than 100 yards away. "The camera isn't seeing what we're seeing," David told his father. "Either there's something wrong with my phone, or there's something wrong with that village." As they got closer to the settlement, Jimmy began recognizing architectural details and decorative elements that indicated the village was much older than its apparent good condition suggested. The building construction techniques, tool marks, and artistic styles were consistent with Inupiat communities from the late 19th or early 20th century, periods when traditional construction methods were still commonly used. More disturbing was Jimmy's growing recognition of specific individuals within the village community. Some of the people he observed were ancestors he remembered from his childhood, relatives who had died decades earlier, but were now engaged in daily activities as if they were still alive and living in their traditional community setting. "That's my grandfather," Jimmy whispered, pointing toward an elderly man who was working on hunting equipment outside one of the houses. "But he died when I was 12 years old. And that woman by the drying racks is my great-aunt Martha. She's been dead for 20 years. David saw his own deceased relatives among the village population, including grandparents he'd known as a child and great-grandparents he'd only heard about in family stories. They all appeared to be living in the village as if it were their normal residence, engaged in the traditional activities and community relationships they'd maintained during their physical lives. The two hunters approached the village cautiously, unsure whether they should interrupt what appeared to be some form of spiritual or supernatural community gathering. The residents seemed unaware of their presence, continuing their daily activities without acknowledging the arrival of modern visitors on snowmobiles. Jimmy called out greetings in traditional Inupiat, using formal language appropriate for addressing elders and community leaders. Several village residents looked in his direction, but their expressions suggested they couldn't see him clearly or weren't certain of his reality. They responded to his voice, but seemed to be having difficulty focusing on his physical presence. One of the village elders, whom Jimmy recognized as his great-grandfather Samuel, approached the boundary where the traditional village landscape met the modern ice field. Samuel spoke in traditional Inupiat, welcoming Jimmy and David to the community, but explaining that they couldn't enter the village while they were still connected to the contemporary world. "You are traveling in the new time, but our village exists in the old time. We can see each other across the boundary between times, but we cannot share the same space until you choose to join us permanently in the traditional world." Samuel gestured toward the village, showing Jimmy and David the life they could have if they abandoned their modern existence and joined the ancestral community. The village offered traditional subsistence living, family relationships with deceased relatives, and spiritual connection to Inupiat cultural practices that had been disrupted by historical change and modernization. But Samuel also warned them that joining the village would mean leaving the contemporary world permanently. The drifting settlement existed in a temporal and spiritual space that was separate from modern Alagas, accessible only to those who were willing to abandon their connections to current reality and embrace the traditional lifestyle that the village preserved. Jimmy felt a powerful temptation to join his ancestors in the village community. The opportunity to reconnect with deceased family members and live according to traditional Inupiat practices was profoundly appealing after decades of watching his culture adapt to modern pressures and external influences.
David was equally attracted to the village, but also concerned about his responsibilities to living family members who would be affected by his disappearance. His wife and children in Barrow depended on him, and joining the ancestral community would mean abandoning his obligations to the contemporary Inupiat community where he had established his adult life. The decision was complicated by the realization that the village was drifting toward open ocean, where it would either sink beneath the waves or disappear into spiritual dimensions that couldn't be accessed from the physical world. If they were going to join the community, they needed to make their choice immediately, before the village moved beyond the reach of living humans. Samuel sensed their internal conflict and offered additional guidance about the nature of the choice they faced. The village represented the preserved essence of traditional Inupiat culture, maintained by the spirits of ancestors who wanted to ensure that their way of life continued to exist even after historical disruption had changed the physical communities where their descendants lived. The village travels to different locations and times, appearing to living people who are ready to choose between the modern world and the traditional world. Some join us and help maintain our community in the spirit realm. Others return to their contemporary lives, but carry our teachings and memories back to the living world. Jimmy and David spent several hours at the boundary between worlds, talking with their ancestors and learning about the village's purpose and the choice they were being offered. The experience provided them with cultural knowledge and spiritual connections that had been lost through generations of historical change and modernization. But ultimately, both hunters decided to return to their contemporary lives in Barrow, carrying the village's teachings back to their living community. Samuel and the other ancestors accepted their decision with understanding, explaining that preserving traditional culture in the modern world as important as maintaining it in the spiritual realm. As Jimmy and David traveled back toward frozen truths that never melt. The 12 stories you've just heard represent more than isolated incidents scattered across Alaska's vast wilderness. They are connected threads in a tapestry of mystery that blankets America's last frontier, where the boundary between the explainable and the impossible grows thinner with each passing winter. These accounts, drawn from police reports, personal testimonies, and documented evidence, reveal that Alaska's small towns and remote settlements exist in a unique relationship with forces that conventional understanding cannot accommodate. From Marcus Chen's endless phone calls reporting his own death, to the drifting village where ancestors offer choices between worlds, each story illuminates aspects of a larger truth about Alaska's spiritual geography. This is a land where permafrost preserves more than organic matter, where aurora displays can unlock temporal doorways, and where isolation creates conditions for encounters that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. The witnesses to these events weren't seeking paranormal experiences or supernatural encounters. They were ordinary people going about their daily lives, dispatchers working routine shifts, seasonal employees earning wages, hunters pursuing traditional subsistence activities, and medical professionals providing health care to remote communities. Their testimonies carry weight precisely because they came from individuals with no agenda other than reporting what they observed and experienced.
What makes these Alaska stories particularly compelling is their consistency across decades and geographic regions. The same types of phenomena appear repeatedly in different locations, reported by unconnected witnesses who had no knowledge of similar events occurring elsewhere in the state. Ice entities, temporal anomalies, underground intelligences, and ancestral contacts emerge as recurring themes that suggest systematic rather than random occurrences. Alaska's unique environmental conditions may contribute to these phenomena in ways that science is only beginning to understand. The extreme isolation, extended periods of darkness and light, electromagnetic activity of aurora activity, and the preserved landscapes of permafrost create a natural laboratory where the normal rules of reality may operate differently than in more temperate and populated regions. But beyond environmental factors, there's something about Alaska's cultural history that seems to attract or preserve mysteries that other regions lose to development and modernization. The state's native communities maintain spiritual relationships with the land that acknowledge dimensions of existence beyond physical reality. Their oral traditions contain accounts of entities, temporal doorways, and spiritual geographies that align remarkably well with the contemporary testimonies documented in these 12 stories. For those who live and work in Alaska's remote areas, these stories aren't entertainment or folklore. They're warnings, guidance, and confirmation of realities that must be acknowledged and respected for safe navigation through landscapes where the mundane and the miraculous exist in close proximity. Bush pilots learn to recognize areas where navigation equipment fails. Construction workers understand that some projects will encounter more than geological challenges. Medical personnel adapt to serve patients whose needs may transcend conventional healthcare delivery. The implications extend beyond Alaska's borders. If consciousness can persist beyond death, if time operates according to different rules in certain locations, and if non-human intelligences share our world in ways we don't typically perceive, then the foundations of scientific materialism require significant revision. Alaska's mysteries suggest that reality is far more complex and interconnected than mainstream academia acknowledges. These stories also raise profound questions about the responsibility that comes with encountering phenomena beyond normal experience. The witnesses in these accounts face choices about whether to publicize their experiences, return to investigate further, or attempt to help entities that seemed trapped in temporal loops or isolated from normal existence. Their decisions shaped not only their own lives, but potentially affected the ongoing relationship between human communities and the mysterious intelligences that inhabit Alaska's hidden dimensions. As Alaska continues to develop and modernize, the question becomes whether these phenomena will adapt, retreat, or intensify in response to increased human presence and technological advancement. Some evidence suggests that the mysteries are patient and persistent, willing to wait centuries for appropriate opportunities to interact with human consciousness. Others indicate that certain types of encounters may be decreasing as traditional cultural knowledge and spiritual practices decline in Alaska Native communities. What's certain is that Alaska's vast wilderness continues to harbor secrets that resist conventional investigation and documentation. The state's remote settlements, abandoned mining sites, frozen lakes, and Arctic regions provide countless opportunities for encounters with phenomena that official science cannot yet acknowledge. Each winter brings new reports, new witnesses, and new evidence that the last frontier remains a place where the impossible regularly intersects with daily life. For travelers venturing into Alaska's remote areas, these stories serve as both warning and invitation. Warning because the wilderness contains more than natural hazards and challenging weather conditions. Invitation because Alaska offers opportunities for expanded consciousness and encounters with dimensions of reality that exist nowhere else in North America. The truth is that Alaska has never been fully mapped, explored, or understood. Its physical geography conceals spiritual landscapes where time flows differently, where consciousness persists beyond death, and where intelligent entities conduct their own observations of human activity. These 12 stories documented here represent a tiny fraction of the encounters that occur regularly throughout the state, most of which go unreported due to fear of ridicule or simple lack of appropriate vocabulary to describe impossible experiences. Alaska's mysteries are not going away. They're woven into the fabric of the land itself, preserved in permafrost and sustained by isolation, aurora energy, and the spiritual practices of indigenous communities who have always known that reality extends far beyond what modern science acknowledges. The entities, temporal anomalies, and paranormal phenomena that characterize Alaska's small towns and remote regions are permanent features of the last frontier, as enduring as the mountains and as persistent as the aurora borealis. So the next time you hear about unusual events in Alaska's remote communities, remember that you're not listening to folklore or imagination. You're receiving testimony about the true nature of a land where the boundaries between worlds remain thin, where ancient mysteries persist beneath the ice, and where every winter night brings new opportunities for encounters that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the possible and the impossible. Alaska keeps its secrets well, but it shares them generously to those who approach the wilderness with respect, open minds, and the understanding that some truths are too large for conventional explanations. In the last frontier, the miraculous is mundane, the impossible is inevitable, and every small town has stories that would revolutionize our understanding of reality if the outside world were ready to listen. The ice preserves everything in Alaska, including mysteries that refuse to melt.